Welcome to Called to Lead, a podcast series on pastoral leadership for today's church, presented by the Markey Center in Santa Clara University's graduate program in pastoral ministries. I'm your host, Dr. John Rinaldo. Join us and explore leadership in the Catholic Church through stories and conversations with pastors, ministers, and scholars. We connect theology with real-world ministry, highlighting how today's leaders answer God's call to build just and inclusive communities. Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Called to Lead. I'm your host, Dr. John Rinaldo, and I feel like I'm always excited about my guests, and it's true today as well. Joined with me today, I have John Roberto, who is the Executive Director of the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, also known as NCCL, but has also been massively influential in the faith formation space. John, I hope you don't mind me saying that, but I truly believe that your impact in the church has had multiple generations, affected multiple generations and multiple generations of leaders. So thanks for being here, John.
Oh, John, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, before we kind of talk about some of your work in leadership and faith formation, NCCL, you've spent a lifetime working in faith formation. How did this journey begin? And just as importantly, how have you sustained it over the years?
It's I began in my college years, and I started in 1969 in what was the Catholic Youth Office, the CYO office of the Diocese of Bridgeport. And it was only 4 years after the council. This was 1969, and there's this a spirit that the sky was the limit. Like the possibilities were there, and the spirit of the council, and everything was kind of a first. So I coordinated youth retreats, which was kind of a brand new thing, that started in the early 60s, but really caught the cap. It was really kind of the heart of youth ministry in those days. And then I coordinated social action programs. Those were, kind of became youth service programs. And I worked for the diocese. Now, the diocese was one county. So just to put in perspective, Diocese of Bridgeport is Fairfield County. So it's just one county. So it was really easy to get around. I grew up in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And so through college, I worked part-time in the office. Some people said I worked full-time in the office, went to college part-time, but I didn't. It was the opposite way. And then I did a year of graduate study, and then I came back and I applied for the director of youth ministry job at the ripe old age of 23, and I got the job. But not to sound impressive, there was no other applicants for the job. So it's like, I was the only applicant. So they said, well, no office, or we'll give it to Roberto. And that's really kind of what launched me. And I did diocesan work for a total of five more years. And then I started the Northeast Center for Youth Ministry because it was still that spirit. You could do things. So it was a church nonprofit in 1978. It was like it's always good to start something when you're young because you have no idea what the questions are and what you should be afraid of. and
Absolutely.
that profoundly shaped me, the chance to do the kind of things we love to do, adult, youth ministry training, youth leadership training, develop programming, work with dioceses and eventually all across the country. You couldn't plan it, obviously, but what emerged, we were at that point in which youth ministry was going through its renewal, and we were able to accompany people on that process, and that was really formative. So, and people do say, how do you stay so long? It's the people,
Hmm.
it's a passion for the mission, but it's the people you get a chance to work with and the opportunities you have to proclaim the good news and to invite people now multiple generations later into relationship with Christ and the church. But it's, the people you get a chance to surround yourself with. Um, it's what sustains you. And that's true right up to today. I work with some of the most amazing people in NCCL, who give their time and talent and who have said yes to working with me and the organization. It's church, small C,
I
in
love
terms of
that.
community.
I think it's so interesting that you talk about your first experience and your focus on retreats and service. Because and saying that some of that was kind of new at the time, where
Yeah.
now here we are in 2026 recorded this, and it's that's old hat in the sense of like, yeah, of course, retreats of justice. I still remember Tom East years ago wrote a book, like a research-oriented book, like Dynamic Practices in Youth Ministry, something like that. It was like 2004. And one of the things that he said is two of the most effective things we could do in ministry with young people today is retreats and service, which, you were doing back in post-Vatican II, right? Late 60s, 70s. That's amazing. That's incredible.
Those two things actually saved youth ministry because remember, CYO and joining clubs and the rest was on the downturn throughout the late 60s into the 70s. And the thing that really attracted young people were doing something and making a difference. That was kind of a product of the 60s, right? Make a difference, change the world. But retreats, which were personal and relational, there was a community, it was very Christ-centered. And those two, I think those two things nationally were kind of like the advent of a more relational, communal style of ministry. But retreats and service programming led the way.
Hmm. That's amazing. And so, as you look back across the decades of ministry, what are the big shifts that you've seen in the church that have continued to shape or have most shaped your understanding of formation and leadership?
I think the biggest shifts have happened in the context in which we do ministry. Um, so like generations have shifted and changed over those decades. The culture has changed. And so the ways that the church is adaptive, like how it provide the way I describe it is adaptive doesn't mean that you're throwing anything out. Adaptive means you're taking a 2,000-year-old mission and you're looking for fresh expressions for that with the generations in front of you. I think the context has changed so dramatically that the church is needs to be adaptive to that new context. It's something it's done, by the way, for 2,000 years. I think, when you look back and say, this is not the church of the first century, it's not the church of the 10th century, it's the church of the 21st century. Um, and I think when you start looking at the 80s, that kind of a style of how do we address the people in our context and the changes around us, I think that adaptive challenge has been with us. And I think today, the adaptive challenge may be the biggest challenge we face. So it's not about changing the mission. It's how do we proclaim the good news and invite people into a relationship with Christ today, which is different than what we did, well, what I did in the 70s or 80s, that's for sure. It was just a different world. And that's three generations or four generations ago.
Yeah, I think you're right about that because I even think about my own history ministry and the things that I did when I started in 2001 I wouldn't do today, or I would do them differently because they just don't work. And that's the shift that I think we're called to make. And so in light of that, when we're talking about forming leaders, like both you and I have a passion for leadership formation in the church. I think sometimes we think there's not enough of that, right? But when we talk about forming leaders in the church, how is that conversation truly inseparable for what we're trying to do within faith formation itself?
Yeah. The formation of leaders is one of the things that we have been slow to adapt to, and that is leadership formation for decades, more than that, was very content centered. And so, like I'll use catechist formation as an example.
Yeah.
We have this content. You will go through this in X number of semesters, and right, and you get certified at the end of it, right?
And we
And,
still do that. That's a very common reality in many
right.
dioceses across the country. It's not bad, but
No, no, but but and see, this is one of these. The content's terrific. It's the delivery system or structure in which it exists. And so today, people have changed. The people that we're talking about in leadership in parishes, I call it bivocational in the sense that people who are coordinating ministry, the majority of them today across the country are not full-time paid professionals. They're they're people who are professionally trained, perhaps, who work in a parish some of the time and work someplace else a lot of the time to support
yeah.
themselves. And then when it comes to our in quotes volunteer leaders, um, whether it's in catechetical ministry, youth ministry, social ministry, community ministries, this is a little sliver of their time. And so what we have to come to, I think, to understand is that all that content is terrific, but it has to be a person-centered approach to formation. How do we wrap this around people in their context? And so I talk about this a lot as more episodic, more just in time, more tailored to what people need today. And so how often people say, well, they don't have enough theology background, but they're not going to get that background until they start to do something in their ministry where they have context and then the questions arise. The catechist isn't going to come, every Wednesday night in addition to teaching every Sunday afternoon. They're going to choose one of those, and you know what they're going to choose? Sunday afternoon. They're not going to choose Wednesday. So I think the key there is how do we wrap the formation? And today, so 30 years ago, that was really hard to do. Like, oh God. Today we have all the technologies we need, but we have to adapt that kind of what I call an adult-centered mindset, is that we wrap the formation around the person so it's always available, and there are people, mentors, small groups to guide people. So it's not that I mean, I love teaching. I love being in a group and a workshop. And I mean, I've always loved doing that. But you have to blend that with things that are more personal or small group so that it can be delivered just in time to where people are. That's still the hardest shift.
Mm. Even with the technology. I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I think it's the language that you're using, I think, has always been true, but I would argue some of that language of person-centered, of really understanding the context and the episodic phase that they're in is kind of a theme of Pope Francis's papacy, right? When he talks about accompaniment and the idea of, you know, get dirty, right? Smell like the sheep type of thing. And part of that is about knowing the people. And oftentimes we use that language about serving people that are out there, but we should be using some of that same language with some of the people that are already within volunteering staff, whatnot. And that's a missing element, it sounds like. So, but it's very
Yeah,
Francis-ish, I
very much
think, in
so.
that language on that. So you've long emphasized that formation is lifelong and intergenerational. I just think about the history of like intergenerational ministry and generations of faith and some of these other things that have kind of come and maybe gone. But why is that vision of lifelong and intergenerational formation so essential in the cultivation of leadership today?
It's we have a systemic um, challenge. I'll put it that way, because every problem is also an opportunity. So we have a challenge, and that is we tend to look at ministry and faith formation in isolated pockets. So we're there's a lot of concern about, well, where are the young people, right? And the conversation is always about, well, how we get young people back. And I remind groups, those young people were once children. What were you doing with them when they were children? Oh, and those young people come from families. And what are you doing with their parents and the family? Oh, and those young people in about 3 minutes are going to become young adults. And what are you doing with young adults? In other words, not to overwhelm people, that by the way, that always does overwhelm people.
Yes.
But if we have to situate every decade in a whole lifespan. And so most churches, I think they dedicate at least 3/4 of their ministry time, budgets, programming to 10 years of the life cycle,
Mhm.
about 5 or 6 years old to 15 or 16. And if confirmation drops down to grade 8, it's even less time. But we know people live into their 70s and 80s and 90s. Most parishes are 10-decade parishes, but you would never know that in the way they do ministry and faith formation, but they could today. So, yes, I know this was really hard like 30 or 40 years ago. People, oh, I can't run enough programs. I don't have. No, 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 no. That's all changed. We figured that out during the pandemic. If you hadn't got into it earlier, like in the 2010s, you discovered in the pandemic that you can engage people in faith formation, go anywhere with people.
Mhm.
The hardest thing is to help people see that their initiative in a particular decade in terms of 10 decades. And because you're not going to solve, in quotes, the youth problem. Youth don't have a problem. They're doing fine. We have a problem.
Yeah.
Um, we're not going to solve that until we realize that the foundational things that happen in the first decade of life with children and their families is predictive of what's going to happen in the second decade. I mean, we've just got gobs of research. I don't know why we don't listen to it. Everybody is so happy to quote, over the last 25 years, soul searching with Christian Smith's book. Oh, the parents, the most important thing, and then they go
Yep.
back working with youth groups.
Yes,
Well, have you
totally.
involved the parents or the family? Did you notice that the pathways he describes in all of his books since then start in childhood? Well, what do you, like youth ministers should be the biggest advocates for children's ministry and faith
Yeah.
formation and the biggest advocates for family. That's not where the conversation's gone.
No,
And
and we get in our silos. That's part of it,
yeah,
right? It's like I'm responsible for this, I'm responsible for that. I've said for years, decades probably, good youth ministry is good family ministry. If you're not
yeah.
ministering to the family, you're not doing good youth ministry. I say the same thing about children's ministry. Good children's ministry is good family ministry. If you're not engaging families, you're not doing good children's ministry. And for me, that cyclicalness that you talked about, right? Good young adult ministry is affected by good youth ministry. Good youth ministry is affected by good children's ministry. Good children's ministry is affected by good adult faith formation. Good adult ministry is affected by good young adult ministry. And that cycle that you named so well, I think is so key. That's a missing element to this.
Well, and like accompaniment has become part of our lexicon.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's used too much, and you know what happens when we use it too much, then becomes everything's accompaniment.
Mhm.
But if you thought about accompaniment and intergenerational accompaniment with older generation and the younger generation, you have the seeds for lifelong. Like, so people only say that, well, I'm just fostering a relationship. Well, if you're not cultivating the faith of the 60 and over crowd, where are the guides and accompaniers going to come from? So if the big, I have a good friend who says this all the time. If the big people aren't growing, the little people aren't growing either.
Mhm.
Like it's really hard to do great youth ministry in a dead church. So we've got some pathway, like we've taken these steps, like with accompaniment, intergenerational mentoring. And not that I want the youth minister or the catechetical director to take on the whole responsibility, but to be advocates for faith growth, faith maturity is lifelong. And it's so interesting when you go back and read the 1971 the original catechetical directory, the little 64-page, one right out of Vatican II. The whole goal was catechesis is about maturing in faith for a lifetime.
Mhm.
I mean, it's been part of our understanding since the Vatican Council that faith matures over a lifetime. Therefore, catechesis is lifelong. And that, yeah, I'm not going to live long enough to see that. But, it's just like, but when churches embrace that, the culture of the church changes.
Yeah.
Everybody realizes that they're all on a path to learning and growth. And that then, and correspondingly, which I think is really central here, is that the youngest have something to share with the oldest and the oldest with the youngest.
Mm.
That everybody's a learner and everybody's a teacher. When a church gets there, oh my goodness, it just flowers because everyone has a story to share. Everyone can help you grow in faith. Everyone can be engaged in mission to the world. And so that's why I think intergenerational ministry and faith formation is so crucial because our church used to take all of that for granted because it got it for free.
Mhm.
It had intergenerational families growing up in neighborhoods, at least in my world on the Northeast, ethnic communities where everybody was bonded by ethnicity and language and traditions, right? We got that for free. Well, it's 2026. You don't get that for free anymore. You have to build it intentionally, but you can. That's the good news is we know how to do these things. It's you have to be a willing parish. I guess the best way to say it.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, willing to say yes, we can do this. But I just think the challenge of being lifelong and the challenge of bringing the generations together, churches that do that, it's a multiplier effect that helps everybody. And you don't even have to have a youth ministry if you have that kind of a parish.
Well, and I wonder if, based on what you're talking about, that the old structures, the leadership structures of parish that we're used to, right? You got the children's minister, you got the youth minister, you've got whatever, if that is potentially an obstacle in terms of what we're thinking, right? Because the bishops have actually been saying, the U.S. bishops have been saying that since 1999. Our hearts are burning within us. They said adults should be at the center of all faith formation efforts. But to your point earlier, name a parish that that's actually the case, right?
Very few.
But they knew it. And they knew what you said, that it's going to impact youth, it's going to impact children more than having a dynamic youth ministry program with no adult faith formation. So what does a parish structure look like today, whether it's run by professional staff or volunteers? How do we reimagine that for the 21st century?
Yeah, it's we we still have like the majority of parishes are still 1980s parishes.
Oh, that
And,
feels so bad to
and,
say, but yeah.
and I say that in two ways. The 1980s parish was great in the 1980s. Um, but you can't maintain that because it was a leadership how would I say- it was very much leadership dependent, on the full-time paid people and the rest. Um, but we now need to think about like one of the things about leadership formation, people want to move to formation. I think how many parishes still do a real intentional effort to discern the gifts and talents of their community? Like, like like what are people bringing with them that can be used in ministry within the parish, but also out to the world? And how is the parish the sending station, so to speak,
Mhm.
missional station? So, I mean, we talk about missionary discipleship, and then we create a program, and I think, oh no,
Another program.
here it goes again. Like the whole impetus there is that if you're a disciple of Jesus Christ, you're living the mission,
Yeah.
whether it's within the community or out to the world. I think a parish that embraces lifelong learning, faith growth, a parish that embraces intergenerational connection, and a parish that embraces an intentional way to discern the gifts of people is going to create some new structures to be able to respond to that. More flexible, like thinking about a parish council as a council of ministries,
Mhm.
that's less about the new roof. Delegate that to a committee, but it's more about how do we live out our missionary ministries. I this is Even though there's a lot of resistance in the U.S. church, synodal theology and practices, more than simply conversation in the spirit. Everyone lances onto that. Conversation fits into this,
Mhm.
but synodal theology and practices, seeing the church more horizontal and gifted than vertical. That one shift, listening, discerning, and acting together, can change a whole church.
Mhm.
And so I think we said, what will the structures look like? I think they're going to be very contextual. I think a parish in the city and three parishes connected in a rural setting are going to organize differently for a mission. Same mission, just organized differently for it. And that's I think that's the creative part of leadership. But with all the like, at least in my part of the world, with all the parish mergers and connections and the rest, it's hard to discern what that can look like.
Mhm.
So I think I talk about these are the building blocks or the Lego blocks that we need to put in place, but they're going to be shaped uniquely around each of the communities. Um, we have a lot of work to do in that spec, and and we can't keep on looking back to the 1980s for the big mega churches,
Right.
non-denominational churches, as an inspiration because they've all gone through two or three generations of change since then.
Mhm.
So we hold up. Well, we're going to do this program that they did in the 80s. And I'm thinking, but we don't have 80s people. We have 2026 people. Um,
Who maybe still be thinking like they're in the 80s, right? And
yeah,
I think if we're honest, we all get stuck in that trap because it's easier to go back to what we know as leaders
yes.
versus try to get creative and innovate and think about what could be, not for the sake of innovation, but for evangelization ultimately, right? And how do we evangelize today?
And that's where the synodal theology and practices can be helpful to us
Mhm.
because it starts with this vision of a church on a mission. So Pope Francis really tried to kind of wake us up,
Yeah.
right? And say it's all about mission. And then structure needs to match with the mission, not the mission into the structure, right?
Mhm.
And but the synodal practices of listening, not only listening, but listening and then discerning what the Spirit is saying through our people, and then acting in new ways, fresh ways around that, that can bring back life. It doesn't mean you have to change everything. It's really more about fresh expressions of our mission for today.
Mhm. So, a parish or a diocese that truly values leadership formation, what does that look like in practice, right? Because part of what we do in this podcast is let's try to get some practical here. So we're not going to answer everything today, but what are some steps that a parish leader, a diocesan leader begin to take to change some of this culture?
I'll just I'll start with the person. And I think we needed to build our leadership formation around the different things that people do in the different roles of ministry that they have. And we need to ask them and listen. We need to ask them, what's your next best step in your ministry? Right. So, and behind me is a library of all kinds of interactive experiences and video and the rest that I can bring out of the treasury to help them. But it starts with that discernment piece. So, like I'm very practical. So, what does a first grade catechist really need? And my hunch is church history would be nice, but that's not going to help them with first graders, right? So,
Classroom management.
yeah, like who are these first graders in front of me, and why are they doing those things? Um, but but they also are time stretched, so they don't have time to take a course, but they do have time to do the thing that everybody does in those age groups, and that is they watch YouTube.
Hmm.
So you want to fix your plumbing, you put a YouTube video on.
Yeah.
You want to, right? You get stuck with the IKEA furniture and the instructions don't work. You watch the video on YouTube, right? So, but that's what I mean by how can we help you grow as a witness? So I love the threefold understanding of the catechist in the directory for catechesis, because education and accompaniment and a mystagogue. Well, how can we help you become more confident, more capable, more deeply engaged with your faith as you work with first graders, work with high school kids, as you work with adults, as you do outreach work to those who have kind of like given up on the church? Um, what do you need? And then in that discernment to personalize it in a way to say, here's your growth plan.
Hmm.
And then here's some of our mentors or guides who have been doing this for a long time who will accompany you, not teach, but accompany, and support you and encourage you. Because every parish has mystagogues, the people who can accompany. They're there. They might say, "No, I'm not teaching fifth graders anymore. I've been there, done that." But I would love to support those who are working with children or teens or doing OCIA. I can be the support, the guide. I can be part of their support group for that kind of thing. Every parish has all those assets, but it's a fundamental change is just ground what we do. Like there's plenty of resources now. Ground what we do in the person and the person's growth in faith and growth in their ministry. And I would apply that to really any ministry in a parish. Um, it's incumbent on us, like people at NCCL and national organizations, to say, here's the library. Draw what you need out of the library. Here are pathways for their growth, as opposed to programs for them.
So tell us a little bit about NCCL and what you guys are up to and where people can find those resources, because I think what you all are doing there could be super helpful to the listeners of this podcast.
Uh, the best place to go is ncclcatholic.org. That's our main website. And then we have some project websites, one on family, one on pathways to vitality, which is our synodal project, and one on children and worship. But the heart of what we're doing at NCCL is really twofold. We're doing everything we can to be advocates for lifelong catechesis through training, through resources, through just being able to surround people with this is where we want to go in catechetically. The Directory for Catechesis talks about this emphatically. Now we want to put it into practice. We're going to be here. We're ready to accompany you. We'll walk with you. And the other was the formation of parish and diocesan catechetical leaders, with a variety of different things. We've kind of carved out in one of our programs is we have a certificate program in the practice of catechesis. So again, in this library kind of a format, right? There's great theology, scripture, spiritual formation, but the actual formation people get to actually do the parish catechetical work was something we thought was lacking. So we have a certificate for people who are parish catechetical leaders or want to be a parish catechetical leader, 1 year in the practices of catechesis. And then we have a version of that in Spanish as well,
Oh,
developed
wow. Good.
in Spanish. It's a different model, but very similar content. It's all grounded in the directory for catechesis. So we put a big emphasis on the formation of leadership that is as flexible as we can be with a national approach, right? We're going to do a catechist training, practices of catechesis, but for the catechist, um, very video based, modular, pick out what you need when you need it, little guide to how you can do that. And so that's kind of what we're doing on the formation side. Our family project is huge. Putting families at the center of faith formation in the first 2 decades of life. We're blessed to work with about 225 parishes across the country, with great consultants who work with them. And they're going to create I think, some really innovative things. We have to keep on telling them, you can do this. You can do this. This will work. Trust us. We're here to support you. And four of the cohorts of the 24 are Spanish speaking parishes.
Oh,
So
wow. Good.
we're really looking forward to that to see what we learn there. Um, and the children in worship and prayer. How do you really build a culture in your parish that's child inclusive and child welcoming? And we'll do that through liturgical life, and then we'll do it through prayer. So we're kind of like, we want to be a kind of an incubator for new ideas. That's what these Lilly Endowment granted projects are doing. We want to be a place where formation could take place, and we want to keep on advocating for the vision of the Directory for Catechesis that's lifelong. And there are a lot of resources on the website, and there'll be more resources. But I'm blessed. I mean, I've been at this for 3.5 years, never imagined doing it at this point in my life. But the organization was just at a hinge point that it was going to move ahead or not.
Mhm.
And it's moved ahead. But it's the people. It's the people that work with me in NCCL, and it's the parish and diocesan leaders who have said this is what we need to support us. So
That's
we're
awesome.
really blessed.
NCCLcatholic is
Yeah,
the website. All
yeah.
right, that's awesome. One last question for you. I don't know if I prepped you for this one, John, but tell us, what's your biggest hope for the church today?
My biggest hope is that it embraces the spirit of what Pope Francis and Pope Leo are advocating for us. The spirit of inclusive, welcoming, open to the spirit, um, and not a church that's figured it all out. I know we've been around for 20 centuries, but you have to figure it out in every generation. And I think the witness of these last two men, who have served as popes, and one pretty old man, Pope Francis was not a young guy when he took over, but opened us up to the sense that we can be creative, we can be innovative, we can trust in the Spirit's work in our church. And you don't have to have all the answers, just go with the flow. And I'll often think I grew up in the Church of John the 23rd. I mean, I was a little kid, 10 years old or so, but that whole line of opening up the doors, opening up the windows to let the spirit of change and renewal come into the church. I think that's what Pope Francis and Pope Leo are both saying, in a very different world than the world that John the 23rd was in. Um, and so I'm inspired by that. I'll just give you one little glimpse.
Please.
We want to do it. We want to do a project on aging and spirituality. I've written a couple of grants for it, and I'm hoping we get the money for it. But I'm taking my cues from the Vatican, which in 2025 have 3 international symposiums on aging, spirituality, the brain, the impact on society. And And wasn't just Catholics. The AARP International was a co-sponsor. The Muslim Brotherhood Council was the another sponsor. I mean, it was like this. They brought everybody. This was the Vatican, right? I'm thinking that's what gives me lots of hope is that they get it and they're leading the way. And I keep on saying, U.S. Church, you think you're so innovative? The Vatican's way out in front of you on this, right? And I think that across the board, you just see those signs where they're interpreting this, they're listening, they're discerning, and they're acting. And I think that's hopeful for me. Um, and these are not these are some troubling times to be in. But there's been a steady voice from Rome, from Pope Francis, and I'll just use the last 15 years, from Pope Francis and now Pope Leo, that just provides us calm in the midst of all this. And Pope Leo is addressing all the big issues. AI. I mean, the church is actually out ahead of people thinking about the ethical implications of AI. And they started a decade ago
Mhm.
when we didn't know what AI stood for, you
Yeah,
know?
we're definitely looking forward to that conversation as well. John, that brings me hope as well. I appreciate you naming that. And thank you so much for coming on this episode of Call to Lead. We
Oh, you're
really
welcome.
appreciate you being here. Your decades truly of wisdom are still important to hear. So I'm so excited to have had this opportunity. So thank you again, John Roberto, who is the Executive Director for the National Conference for Catechetical Leaders, NCCL. Thank you again. That wraps up another episode of Called to Lead, presented by the Markey Center for Leadership in Ministry at Santa Clara University's graduate program in pastoral ministries. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode, and we'll see you at the next episode. Wishing you all a great day, and God bless.